Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. US President Donald Trump wrote on his Truth Social account that because of other countries' testing programs, he has instructed the Department of War to begin testing nuclear weapons on an equal basis, a process he says will start immediately. What does this mean? How risky is it? Will Trump really resume nuclear testing? And if he does, who will be the biggest winner? I tried to find answers to these questions with Stephen Herzog, professor of the practice at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies in Montreal, California, and an associate of the Harvard University Project on Managing the Atom. And we also discussed Catherine Bigelow's new movie, A House of Dynamite, about a missile attack against the United States. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Stephen, before we go directly to what was the trigger for this debate, and that is US President Donald Trump's statement about reintroducing the nuclear tests, let's talk about you a bit. You're a former US Department of Energy Treaty Verification official working on the prohibition of nuclear testing. Can you tell us more about the responsibility at the time and your role?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's nice to meet you, and I'm also happy that your listeners are engaging with this topic. So I am now today a professor in California working on these types of issues, but my title is Professor of the Practice because I am an academic as well as a former practitioner. The U.S. Department of Energy has a sub-branch called the NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is often confused by people in the media with the NSA, the National Security Administration, right, which are spies doing types of intelligence. And one of the things that people don't realize is that the Secretary of Energy in the U.S. might as well be called the Secretary of Nuclear Weapons because over 60% of the Department of Energy's budget goes towards nuclear weapons. And so that includes people doing the technical work to maintain the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile in the absence of nuclear explosive tests, since the United States has not tested nuclear weapons since 1992. That includes people working on naval nuclear propulsion and reactors. That includes people doing radiological incident response. So my job in a past life is I was the program manager responsible for a global outreach program that involved taking scientists from the U.S. national laboratories and going around the world and working with foreign counterparts to help them build up their expertise to detect nuclear test explosions in support of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. This involved a lot of essentially helping scientists in the Middle East and in Central Asia and in Southeast Asia, some places in Europe, who work on things like earthquake seismology and even, whale tracking with hydroacoustic sensors, learn how to purpose some of their civil and scientific training towards nuclear test explosion monitoring because these things are related and they use some of the same essentially seismoacoustic waves and the identical sensors. So I spent a number of years doing that before I went back to school.
When you have been working with those people, with those scientists, and you have been looking at maybe at earthquakes and similar phenomena, was there any kind of case that somebody thought, okay, that could be a nuclear test, something like that? It's probably a little bit too simplistic, but I'm just curious.
This is an intriguing question because we've seen this before. An example is last year, there were seismic events that happened in Iran, which is a place which has lots of earthquakes. It's in an area of the world that's on all sorts of fault lines. The geophysical background of Iran is such that there's lots of seismic activity. And lots of people in the media were saying, well, maybe Iran's conducted a nuclear explosive test. And this happens, I would say, quite a lot. And so, in an area like North Korea, for example, if you see a seismic event in North Korea, close to the North Korean test site, it's almost certainly what you think it is, because North Korea is a fairly aseismic region where you don't have a lot of these events. But there is quite a lot of difficulty in discriminating what is a human-made event. So that could be a nuclear test, that could be a blast in a mine quarry or something, from an earthquake. And so part of the real difficulty is looking at those seismic waves, particularly in active regions, and saying, hey, what's this? And all the data that's collected around the world is actually through this, what's called the International Monitoring System, which is a system set up by the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization based in Vienna. And they are collecting sensor data all day, every day. And it goes to Vienna, and they use a combination of human analyst and AI to look at this. And then they actually send it to the states of the world to take a look. But the answer is this, really. If you see a seismic reading and you think, hey, that looks suspicious, the thing is in most cases, there will be some seepage of radionuclides, like specific isotopes of xenon that you'll find in the atmosphere. So you can find particles, you can find noble gases and things like that, and that will help you that will give you the final confirmation that a test has happened. But yes, training scientists to be able to look at the seismogram and say, hey, is this suspicious or not? There's a science and an art to it.
So, to Trump's statement, the American president wrote on his Truth Social that because of other countries' testing programs, he instructed Department of Defense, Department of War, as he wrote, to start testing nuclear weapons on an equal basis, and that process will begin immediately. What was your reaction when hearing this?
Well, my first reaction was that the Department of War doesn't actually test nuclear weapons. It's the Department of Energy, which is fine. My second reaction was, what was he talking about? What were these tests of nuclear weapons? And what it seems to be is it seems to relate to two Russian tests of delivery systems for nuclear weapons. So, as I think many listeners will know, Russia has recently tested a series of novel systems. These include essentially an autonomous underwater drone, which is nuclear capable, and they also include a nuclear-powered, nuclear-capable cruise missile. Now, these were tests, though, of the delivery systems for the weapon. These were not supercritical reactions that are causing a mushroom cloud because the physics package of the weapons was not actually tested. So there was a lot of confusion about what was Trump saying in relation to this. Was he confusing these Russian events for actual mushroom clouds in the sky or a rumbling test underground? And it became interesting because the United States, as I mentioned, has not tested nuclear weapons since 1992. And for Russia, it's a similar time frame. And the United States has carried out 1,032 nuclear explosive tests. Russia's carried out 715. China's carried out 45, et cetera. And then it goes down from there. And so, India, Pakistan, much lower numbers, North Korea, lower numbers. But in the past couple decades, the only country to have tested nuclear weapons, as your listeners will know, is North Korea, which has carried out 6 tests. So people are like, what is Trump talking about? Because before then, it was India and Pakistan in 1998. And my next thought was, if the United States starts testing nuclear weapons again, this will be seriously problematic because Russia and China, which have not conducted nuclear weapons tests either, will surely follow suit, and it will open Pandora's box and will set a new precedent for testing nuclear weapons. In fact, if the United States starts testing nuclear weapons again to learn about its weapons, the biggest winner is going to be China, which is far behind the United States and Russia as far as the knowledge it can get from tests. For a number of years, actually decades now, the directors of the U.S. weapons laboratories have had this certified as sitting president in the United States that they can ensure that the U.S. nuclear stockpile is safe, secure, and reliable without nuclear explosive testing. And we have a program called Stockpile Stewardship, where we do supercomputing simulations, laser physics experiments, things like that. And to your listeners who have seen Star Trek Into Darkness, for example, the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where they do laser fusion experiments to simulate what would happen inside of a physics package of a thermonuclear weapon, was featured there. So that was one. And so there was a lot of confusion. And the other question I had is, could the United States actually do this immediately? The former U.S. nuclear test site in Nevada, where I've been and spent some time at in previous life, has not, again, tested nuclear weapons since 1992. U.S. test readiness is estimated at being about maybe 3 years, but it's probably earlier than that. I would say it's going to be a year and a half, something like that. But that would be to carry out a fully instrumented nuclear test where the United States could take all the measurements and could improve its arsenal. Now, Trump could, I guess, order a nuclear test, but it wouldn't be fully instrumented. It wouldn't be useful. Maybe he could even do something atmospheric, and that would be awful and something which has not happened since 1963 and carries massive downwind consequences. So the last point that I would make is this. The U.S. Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, came out after Trump spoke and said that the United States would not carry out nuclear explosive tests of the physics package. It would test the other non-nuclear components of weapons. And your standard nuclear weapon has probably about 5,000 parts, and many of them can be tested without the physics package. But President Trump has now come out and has made the statement that countries around the world, particularly Russia and China, are carrying out tests, and they're happening underground, and it's a little rumble, and you can't see what's happening, and the United States will immediately start testing of its own to be a leader.
I wanted to ask you about this Trump statement because Trump's accused Russia, China, and Pakistan of secretly, as you mentioned, of secretly testing nukes. Does anything suggest it is true, or is it essentially a totally false claim?
This is a difficult claim because it leads to a long-standing series of disagreements in the U.S. national laboratories and the intelligence community about what Russia and China in particular are doing. The Pakistan situation was new. I'd not heard a whole lot about that before. And there have been statements such as in 2019 during Trump's first administration, where at the Hudson Institute think tank in Washington, the director of Trump's Defense Intelligence Agency, General Robert Ashley, came out and said that Russia and China were testing nuclear weapons. And this was covered majorly in the news media, and it took a lot of people by shock. And the issue is this. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, as I mentioned, is currently monitoring the globe, and there are all sorts of sensors. The United States and other countries have what are called national technical means and their own sensors, which provide additional inputs into this. Now, Trump is talking about what might be very, very small tests, which would be so small that would not be picked up by these sensors. That's really difficult to verify that it's happening. It could be other seismic events. It could be on the basis of other intelligence. And my view would be this. First, if these countries were really trying to do it, it would be very risky because if it got out of control and they got caught, there would be an international incident for them testing nuclear weapons again. So it's very difficult to imagine them trying to do this. The second thing is such a small test is unlikely to be the type of test which will be useful at a militarily significant level for cheating. It might help you with a small safety feature or something else like that. So the third thing I would say is maybe this is a reason why we need the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to be in force. China has signed but not ratified the treaty. The United States has signed but not ratified the treaty. And Russia had previously ratified the treaty, but a couple of years ago withdrew its ratification and now just a signatory on par with China and the United States. If that treaty were in force, and a state could provide evidence to the international organization that they thought a test was happening, it could be ordered that an on-site inspection would happen and inspectors could go to that territory if, of course, the state would allow them. And we can't see into these states because we can't have inspectors on the ground because the treaty is not in force. So I think it's a debate. I think it's dubious. And I think one of the other things that often happens is this concept we call mirror imaging. And that is that Western leaders often tend to look at things that happen in Russia and China as far as weapon systems and say, hey, look at that development. They must be testing nuclear weapons or they must be, doing this and this. And the reason why they say that is because if they were going to develop that system, they would test. And that implies the same standard operating procedures. It implies needing the same level of confidence in the weapon systems to make those accusations. And so I think it's very difficult what Trump is saying to verify. And again, I think if the United States were to return to nuclear testing, I think it would be expensive. I don't think the United States is ready. And I think it would lead to other countries around the world testing nuclear weapons. And Trump and his administration and the U.S. national security establishment and the U.S. people and U.S. allies would be the biggest losers at the end of the day because of the capabilities their adversaries would develop by testing.
But do you think that Trump will do it?
I don't know. And I think that one of the things that I've thought about over and over again is Trump is probably thinking about nuclear weapons tests as the type of things you see in the movie Oppenheimer. These types of tests from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which were giant mushroom clouds. And there was a period in U.S. history before 1963 in the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty where there were people who, they saw this as an element of U.S. status. The Nevada National Security Site, formerly known as the Nevada Test Site, has a series of chairs in multiple places set out there. And that's because back in the day, the scientists would, in the desert, sit there wearing their special goggles and protection, and they would watch low-yield atmospheric nuclear test explosions happen in the distance. And those are there as a memorial to the testing program. There is a segment, I think, of the U.S. military and political establishment that I think might want a return to that type of testing for the purposes of signaling. I hope not, and I hope that if Trump is thinking about a return to nuclear testing, that he will get lots and lots of briefings from the intelligence community, the Department of War, the Department of Energy, and the State Department that will say that, yes, if the United States started testing nuclear weapons again, it could make improvements in its weapons, but the United States would be the biggest loser at the end of the day because the gap between the United States and China in particular on nuclear weapons would be closed if the United States started to test again. So it's all up in the air. As with what a lot of President Trump says, a lot of it is rhetoric. Some of it happens. It's very surprising when it does or doesn't happen. Whether you like the guy or not, you have to admit he does keep us on the edge of our seats as analysts and journalists, and he is on some level entertaining. But at the end of the day, I think it would be an unwise decision, and I don't know whether he'll do it.
Stephen, from what you are saying, I think that if Trump would come to you and he would ask you, should I do this? You would say no. But then let's say that he will press you and would say, but I want to do something. I want to improve the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Would you have something for him?
I would say that we should have greater investments than in stockpile stewardship if that's the case. I would say that the United States could potentially leverage, future next generation artificial intelligence as well to improve in the modeling of new nuclear weapons. But here's the thing. I don't think that any of this needs to happen because I think that the systems that the Russians are testing that President Trump is so concerned about and the systems that China is testing, again, not nuclear tests, just delivery vehicles, are not nearly as sophisticated as what the United States has. I don't think there's there's no gap between the United States and Russia which doesn't favor the United States. In fact, the systems that Putin has been testing recently are legacy systems which are decades old. I don't think there's anything to be worried about in general. So if Trump were to come to me and say, should I test nuclear weapons? I would say absolutely not. And I would point to all the different political effects. I would point to the military and strategic effects for the United States and its allies. And heaven forbid, if Trump was talking about carrying out an atmospheric nuclear test, I would talk about the provocative nature of that. And I would talk about all the victims of the downwinds of nuclear explosive tests that exist in parts of the Southwest in the United States. Essentially, we have compensation for that. I would talk about as well, he would probably care less about this. I would talk about the victims of the Soviet test in Kazakhstan. I would talk about the people in Algeria when the French tested. I would talk about the indigenous people, Aboriginal, in Australia when the British tested. I'm not sure if that would move President Trump at all, but there is no technical gap which does not favor the United States. The United States has the best and most sophisticated nuclear arsenal in the world. And I think that Trump talking about testing nuclear weapons is more of a show of force and to try and be involved in some signaling. One thing that I think is super important to mention is President Trump has said that he would like an arms control agreement with Russia and China. And I think this might be one of these attempts of the president to try and negotiate from a position of strength. by threatening to carry out nuclear tests, he might be hoping that China, for example, which doesn't engage in nuclear arms control, would join into a treaty. I think, again, this might backfire spectacularly because China has the most to gain by the United States restarting nuclear testing and then China being able to open up its testing program again.
But interestingly, when you mentioned China, Trump published his post about nuclear tests just hours before he met the Chinese leader Xi Jinping. So do you think it was a message for Beijing?
I think it absolutely was a message for Beijing. And again, I think this desire by Trump to always be negotiating from a position of strength, to say, I will be willing to do this in order to compel you to get to the table and to get a good bargain. And sometimes that may work and it may come up with amazing results which look good. But other times, if you make threats and your adversary calls your potential bluff, then you have to follow through on them. And this would be bad for the United States in general. I don't think that China would be upset if the United States started testing nuclear weapons again. I'm sure China has a lot of designs of new nuclear weapons capabilities they would love to test, and the United States would essentially be giving them a green light to do so.
You mentioned Russians, and you said that those systems, this Poseidon or Wehrwestnik or others, are basically legacy systems. But in fact, Russians are saying those are super duper modern weapons that nobody can stop. What's your reaction to this?
Well, they are legacy systems, and just because they're legacy systems doesn't mean that they can be stopped. And the reason why Russia is pulling out these legacy systems, I believe, is one, they're legacy systems. They've already put in the money into these things, and their military budget is quite strained given the war in Ukraine. But the other thing about it is the Russians are scared of U.S. development of ballistic missile defense, in particular Trump's Golden Dome initiative. Now, in the United States and in Western countries, leaders always talk about ballistic missile defense and how effective ballistic missile defense is or how we need to invest in it. And it makes sense. If you're a Western politician in a democratic state, you need to tell your population that you will protect them. The early days of the Cold War, where Western governments engaged in mutual vulnerability with the Soviet Union, are gone. That is politically unpalatable in Washington. It's unpalatable in London. It's unpalatable in Brussels. Now, compare that to the position in Russia or China, where they want declarations of mutual vulnerability and deterrence with the United States, and they don't have the same responsibilities to the voters and the population. So as the United States talks about developing ballistic missile defense, the Russians say, regardless of what they say, this may be a Trojan horse for them to eventually cancel out our arsenal. And so Putin and his commander's response is asymmetric. They are trying to develop, essentially rehabilitate old systems to send a signal to the United States that your ballistic missile defense is not going to work. And the thing is ballistic missile defense is extremely expensive. It's been around for decades. It has failed tests repeatedly. It's never conducted under ideal situations dealing with decoys and countermeasures from adversaries. For example, if you can get a ballistic missile into space, you can also throw up a bunch of balloons and chaff and other things which can disrupt U.S. ballistic missile defense sensors. So the percentages and chance of success on that are very low, but that doesn't mean that the Russians are not responding in a way which is asymmetric. And I think that that is, the answer. And so all this rhetoric about it being unstoppable, I think what the Russians hope is to trade away these legacy systems in a future agreement, which results in constraints on U.S. missile defense.
There are also many current discussions about nuclear weapons due to the new movie, A House of Dynamite. And the movie dramatizes an 18-minute window between the launch of a nuclear missile bound for the U.S. and its impact, while the American government doesn't know who launched the missiles and is also unable to stop it. So how realistic or unrealistic is this scenario and this movie for you?
Well, I don't think the scenario is very realistic. I think it makes for a good movie, this idea of a so-called bolt from the blue, out of nowhere attack on the United States. But the most realistic scenario for the use of nuclear weapons would be a conventional conflict, perhaps between Russia and NATO, or a conflict between the United States and China, which escalated into a nuclear conflict. You would probably see it coming far in advance. The other thing is the idea of attacking the United States out of the blue with one weapon, not revealing that it was an accident, not saying anything. It's unrealistic. I think an adversary who wanted to cause massive damage in the United States would attack with a lot more weapons. And I think the thing which is most concerning about it is the way they act in the movie is as if when that weapon, which we never see the ending, of course, maybe it malfunctions or something, if it detonates over Chicago, the idea is that the United States will have lost and will have essentially surrendered. And so the US president only has, 19 minutes as it's counting down to determine a response. That's not how that would go. The United States has so-called secure second strike capabilities for its strategic nuclear forces, and that one weapon would not be enough to change that calculus. And the United States has what's called launch on warning posture. Even if there were 1,000 incoming warheads coming at the United States, the U.S. president would still have time to make decisions to retaliate. In a case in which something like this would happen, I think that the president would probably wait just a little bit and allow the national labs and the intelligence community to do more work and to actually attribute where that came from so there could be more purposeful retaliation. One thing that I do think is realistic about the scenario, though, is the scenario and what they're showing is about the fallibility of ballistic missile defense. Now, there are some issues. So, for example, 2 ground-based interceptors from the station in Alaska are launched at the incoming threat. My understanding is that it's supposed to be 4 in these types of scenarios. So, in that case, that would greatly increase the probability that it were to be destroyed. But it is true that these interceptors hitting are, a coin flip or less as far as success. And so, what I think is useful about this is it's a discussion about whether or not American ballistic missile defense and all of these investments, have created this perfect shield in order to keep the U.S. and its allies safe. And I think the answer to that is no. A lot of this still relies on nuclear deterrence and pointing nuclear weapons at each other's countries, which I think is really scary. And I think we need to reckon with the idea of nuclear deterrence because ballistic missile defense is not assured and it will not keep us safe. But the other thing that I worry about it is maybe someone might read this as a ringing endorsement or commercial for Golden Dome, and they'll say that, we need a massive layered U.S. ballistic missile defense system everywhere. I just don't think the physics are there yet. I'm not convinced that it will work, and I think it will be very expensive, and I think it will result in more asymmetric countermeasures from Russia and China. So I would be more in the camp of negotiating arms control with Russia and China.
So how did you like the movie in overall?
So I found the movie to be enjoyable for the sense that, when you work on these issues day in and day out, it's nice to see someone try and portray these types of events. It's nice to have popular culture representations of what you do, which makes it easier to talk to friends and family members who you don't really want to listen to you all the time. So it gives you kind of a place to intervene in discussions and stuff. So I enjoyed it. I think that you need to suspend disbelief a little bit. There were elements of it that I didn't like. I think it started to get a little bit boring and repetitive at parts of it, even with what it was. But no, I'm glad they're covering it. I'm glad that they're looking at the idea of missile defense and they're problematizing missile defense and putting that out there. I just don't think that everything about the scenario should be taken at face value because I think that other things would actually happen than happened in the scenario. And I think people might respond a little bit differently.
Any favorite nuclear weapons movie?
God, I mean, the favorites are the classics, right? Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe, and so War Games. And so those are, the classics in general. So, but again, I'm glad to see that there's enough public salience attached to nuclear weapons and threats related to nuclear weapons that we, now have a House of Dynamite. We've had Oppenheimer recently. One of the things these movies don't do is they, so far in recent years, they haven't taken a political position, I would say. Dr. Strangelove and War Games and some of these other movies, what they did is they problematized nuclear deterrence and nuclear war planning in a way that you see that kind of some of this is crazy. Whereas Oppenheimer didn't really take a position about nuclear dangers, right? It's a biopic. And House of Dynamite, I think your conclusion for what policy recommendations you think should be made as a result of this movie could be very mixed. It could be about ballistic missile defense being a wasted investment and not working. It could be about how lots of money needs to be poured into Golden Dome. It could be seen as perhaps advocacy for early preemptive and preventive strikes and threat situations. There are just so many ways to interpret it. And perhaps that's a lost opportunity to hype up ways to deal with nuclear dangers. I just think that the way that people will read this film will probably be much in line with their prior perceptions of nuclear weapons. And this is not the first time this happened. There is the old U.S. film, The Day After. It still holds the record for the most watched U.S. television movie ever, which talks about attacks in the Midwest of the United States, and it shows survivors, and it is awful, just horribly destructive. And, it's not easy to watch. It's not something to watch while you're eating, but it's a very sobering movie. And they have done scientific studies, academic studies of this, where they had people watch the movie and they asked them questions immediately after the movie. They asked them questions weeks out. And what they saw is that people who were already supportive of nuclear disarmament saw these attacks on the United States in the movie The Day After as a reason why we should have global nuclear abolition and nuclear disarmament. People who supported a robust nuclear deterrent saw the movie. It said, this is why the United States needs to have an even more powerful nuclear deterrent so that this won't happen. It's kind of like the Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima in Japan, which is one of the most moving museums in the world, showing the effects of the bombing, showing artifacts from victims. It's just a human element, and it's so striking. And for people who are proponents of disarmament, who believe in the humanitarian implications of nuclear weapons, they walk through that museum and they often cry. They're really struck by it. They're so moved by what they see, and they leave and they're like, all right, we've got to get rid of nuclear weapons like now. Whereas strong deterrence proponents also walk through the same museum. They may cry too. And when you ask them, how do you feel about it? They say, thank God for the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal, because we can prevent this from ever happening again. So it's a really polarized issue. And I don't think a House of Dynamite will do much to get rid of that polarization.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.